And I'm sure that you've had a friend in the past who has gone through a breakup. Okay? I want you to remember what went on with that friend and their brain during the breakup. Typically, what you're probably remembering is that your friend, right at the time of the breakup, got fixated on some version of my ex is evil, stupid, and crazy, or I'm a victim, and they wouldn't shut up talking about that for weeks or maybe months. Welcome to the Being Dad After Divorce podcast. I'm John Peters, and these are resources to help you cope and co-parent better during and after separation. If you're new to this podcast series, I encourage you to go back and start with episode 1 and then work yourself forward. And if you want to do that, I'll put a link up here right now. Or after this episode is finished, you can go back and start at the beginning and watch the episodes that you have yet to see. So in each of the episodes in this podcast, I share different tips that I have learned over the last 30 years working with thousands of separated parents so that you can be the dad that you want to be during and after your divorce. So in this episode, this is part 1 of a 2-part series where I'm going to talk about a particular brain issue that if you understand it well and you understand how it manifests in your own brain, you are going to be better equipped not only to cope with the challenges that you're experiencing, but it's actually going to make you a much better parent. And in the following episode after this one, I'm going to talk about how understanding this brain issue and working with it effectively can help you address what I think is one of the most important things for separated parents to address to make sure that their kids are not harmed by their divorce. Okay, so watch this one and then definitely watch the follow-up episode of the next one, because these two, hands down, are arguably some of the most valuable things that you can learn to both cope and parent more effectively. All right. So we have to go back to understand what I'm talking about here. We have to actually go back a long time. So this is not just about your story or my story in our lifetimes and during our divorces, but we actually have to go back about 500 and some million years ago. The reason that we're going to go back that far for you to understand this brain issue is that throughout evolution, so after what we call multicellularity, which is when life went from single-celled organisms to multi-celled organisms, what happened is you had cell specialization that in part led to the development of central nervous systems, brains, and peripheral nervous systems, and all the different parts of organisms, right? You and I are very complex creatures with lots of different parts, okay? And the idea is that things exist the way they exist because if they were different, our ancestors wouldn't have survived as well. And this is part of why you and I inherit these complex brains that a lot of the time work for us, but some of the time work against us because of how they function, okay? But if we think about the parts that work against us, they actually played an important role in survivability of our ancestors, okay? This is going to make sense, I promise, okay? So one issue with brains, not just your brain and my brain, but brains going back in time, was that one of the brain's most primary functions is to keep the organism alive. So brains do things that help us survive circumstances where we might get injured or die, okay? And one of the ways that our brains work, and that we assume brains have worked for a very, very long time, is that when we're in a moment of danger, our brains are wired to fixate on the danger and to not let go of that fixation on the danger until we are out of danger. And if you think about this in the context of one of our ancestors being chased by a giant bear, for example, there's a survival advantage if that person's brain is designed to fixate on the bear and to not lose sight of the bear until they're out of danger. Okay? Now, how do our brains decide when we're in danger and when we're not, and when that glue should kick in or not? Our brains decide that based on how stressed out we are about the situation. So, if there's something that we could focus on and we're not stressed out, our attention is governed by other things other than the danger. But when we're stressed out about things, our brains say, what's the most dangerous thing here? And our brains then kick in this mental glue that glues your focus on the danger until you're out of danger, meaning until your brain says, I'm no longer stressed out about this situation. I'll keep the glue functioning to keep the fixation on the target of the danger. So until the bear is gone and out of sight and you're not stressed because you don't see a bear anymore, your brain is going to fixate on the bear. Okay. Obviously, that had survival advantage back in the day when all day, every day, our ancestors were trying to not get eaten by giant bears and saber-toothed tigers and whatnot. However, that is the brain that you inherit. That's the brain I inherit. And part of what that means is that when we are going through a stressful situation, our brains have a tendency to kick in this glue and to say, I'm going to fixate on the danger target until I'm not stressed, right? Obviously, this is going to work against you when you're going through a breakup, when you're going through a divorce, because you've got elevated stress that is sustained. It goes on and on and on, which means the glue function in your brain is going to kick in and stay kicked in, which puts your mental focus on the so-called danger target, okay? And I often talk about this as my ex is evil, stupid, and crazy, or I'm a victim, okay? Those are the ways that it manifests in brains during a breakup or a divorce, right? Now, set yourself aside for a second. And I'm sure that you've had a friend in the past who has gone through a breakup, okay? I want you to remember what went on with that friend and their brain during the breakup. Typically, what you're probably remembering is that your friend, right at the time of the breakup, got fixated on some version of my ex is evil, stupid, and crazy, or I'm a victim, and they wouldn't shut up talking about that for weeks or maybe months, okay? And then at some point, their focus was obviously not only on that, as evidenced by the fact that then they were talking about other random things that didn't have anything to do with the breakup, okay? So your friend that you might be remembering right now, if you've had a friend like that, got stuck with their mental glue, gluing them into this perception of my ex is evil, stupid, and crazy. And it went on and on and on. And where's the point where that glue weakened? When they had adjusted to the situation so that their subjective stress level was low enough that the glue would weaken. And then they had the mental flexibility to not be stuck in this mode of thinking all day, every day, my ex is evil, stupid, and crazy, or I'm a victim, right? Now, I know it's hard for us to turn that lens on ourself and to say, is this happening to me? Because what happens is your brain also is wired to think that you're seeing reality with a capital R. You're not seeing a version of reality that your brain is interpreting, okay? So part of the challenge I know I'm having with you right now, and that I've had with many, many parents when I've raised this point, but I want you to stick with me because this is such an important point if you can get it, okay? The challenge, though, is that we don't want to see that going on in our own brain. Okay, we want to. People argue with me and say, "No, John, I get that you know you think that some people have perceptions, but here's all the evidence of how my ex really is evil, stupid, and crazy, or here's all of the evidence to support my idea that I'm a victim." Right? I'm not trying to deny the objective reality of issues with your ex. I'm not necessarily trying to deny ways that you may have been victimized and are being victimized in the situation. That's not what I'm trying to do. I'm not saying that it's like the Matrix where it's all just a simulation and it's ultimately plastic. There is an objective reality you're dealing with. Your ex is not a perfect person. There are some ways that you are being victimized here, I'm sure. What I'm arguing is that your brain, just like my brain and pretty much all brains, your brain is wired to cause you to be fixated on my ex is evil, stupid, and crazy, or I'm a victim, or some combination of that. And that's not necessarily helpful for you. Why is this not helpful? Because if you're fixated on the bear, you can't stop and smell the roses. If you're fixated on how evil, stupid, and crazy your ex is, you cannot see the positive things in yourself, in your world, in your coping. We need for you to not be victimized. We need for you to be able to cope with the challenges and changes that you're adjusting to. And if you're looking out at the world through a lens that is skewed because only the bear is in focus and you don't have the rest of the world in focus, then you are not going to cope as well, okay? You are going to be more miserable than you need to be, okay? And this is what I see when I work with separated dads who are depressed or anxious or both. Usually when I talk to someone in that state, it's usually earlier in the divorce process where the person is strongly fixated on this particular type of perception, right? Now, it's not crazy. It's not unusual, but it's the way the brain works, right? If I'm about to get eaten by a bear, I don't want to lose sight of the bear until I'm safe. That's what the brain is doing. That's what your brain is doing, okay? But as you already probably know, you are more miserable when you spend all day churning through my ex is evil, stupid, and crazy, or I'm a victim, or both of those things, right? That's not necessarily constructive thinking. It's not necessarily objective thinking. It doesn't necessarily lead to better coping or good choices. It's just a mental fixation that you get mired in, and it makes you more and more miserable, right? So part of this is part one of a two-part series, right? And this one's focused on you coping well and not being unduly depressed and anxious, okay? What I want you to consider is that when you're focused on how bad your ex is or how bad your situation is, realize that part of the strength of that focus is actually driven by a mental glue that kicks in because your stress level is high. So one way to weaken that glue, to give you more fluidity, mental flexibility, to not be fixated on that stuff in a way that makes you unduly anxious and depressed, is to do things to lower your stress, right? Now, I've already started talking a little bit in this podcast series about things you can do to lower your stress, and I'm going to have additional episodes about additional advice about how to generally lower your stress, because the point where the brain lets go of some of that glue is usually when people are coping well enough to not have their stress level up at code red too much of the time. More specifically, and I'm going to make a podcast episode about this topic too, is keep busy. Because people who keep busier are doing things that give their brain something else to focus on at least some of the time. So talking to a friend, getting involved in volunteering, working, doing puzzles, exercise, things that give you a mental focus that can be something other than I'm a victim or my ex is evil, stupid, and crazy. That's going to help you out, right? But it's not a quick fix. There's not a button you can push. There's not a pill you can take that will quickly fix this particular issue. It takes a little bit of time, but the good news is it works itself out, okay? Not with 100% of people. Some people stick in my ex is evil, stupid, and crazy for the rest of their life, and I don't want that to be you, okay? But 90% of people do work their way out of it relatively soon, not as quickly as you would like, but probably more quickly than you expect, okay? One technique that you can experiment with if you're really having trouble getting your brain to unhook from worry or depressive thoughts, right? Obviously, you can go talk to a therapist. Sometimes people need to talk to a therapist in order to get some really good cognitive techniques to cope with acute stress. But one technique that I've taught a lot of people is a technique called concrete thinking, which I'll say in short is doing something with your mind that includes neutral words, simple neutral words. So you've probably heard of people counting to 10 when they get upset. That's an example of that technique because numbers are simple words. They're neutral words. They're not pleasurable or miserable. They're neutral in tone. I'm not going to get too in the weeds of explaining concrete thinking. I'll put a link in the description below if you want to watch a video on my other channel that goes into depth talking about the application of using concrete thinking when you're ruminating or worrying about stuff in a way that you know is not constructive and you'd like a tool for being able to quickly unhook from that. I'll put the link down there in the description below. But let me pause here for a second and say, if you like this kind of content, please hit the like button. If you have comments, please comment below. And feel free to share this if you want to put a link to this video on your social media if you're finding this type of thing helpful. And I appreciate you joining me here today because there's a lot of things you could do with your time. And I appreciate you taking a little time to join me in this podcast today to listen to some of the stuff that I'd like to share with you around this topic. Okay. The other thing to know is if you'd like direct support from me, I run an online group and I have multiple weekly coaching calls. So if you're a separated dad and you would like to get some direct support in a group coaching environment, I'll put a link to that coaching group in the description below. Click through and you can join that group and meet with me and have some direct support to help you deal with whatever issues are most prominent on your radar at this point, right? So the point here is your brain, my brain, all of our brains are wired to get fixated on danger targets. And if we understand that, and then we notice it when it's happening, and we work with it constructively, we can actually reduce our personal misery. And it's also going to lead to better choices, better perceptions, better reactions, and better parenting. Okay? So in the next episode, and I'll put a link here coming up shortly on the screen, watch part 2 of this, My Ex is Evil, Stupid, and Crazy brain thing, because I'm going to teach you in the next one about how that shows up in parenting and how catching that and filtering it out is going to be one of the best things that you can do to protect your kids from the harms and risks of your divorce. So I'll see you in the next episode.